Good evening. This is Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Corsicana, Texas. Today is May the 12th, 2020. The day of May the 12th is important in history as the birthday of a very important man. 174 years ago, May 12, 1846, there was a place in what is now Waller County, Texas. It was then Austin County. On the Sunnyside Plantation was born Norris Wright Cuney. This book I have here I used as a source. A Southern Family in White and Black, the Cuneys of Texas. And this was one of my sources I used for my 2004 book that I wrote, Prince Hall Freemasonry in the Lone Star State, from Cuney to Curtis, 1875 to 2003. Norris Wright Cuney, born May the 12th, 1846, did many things during his lifetime, but a part of his claim to fame is the fact that he was the first Grand Master of what we now know as the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. And that's the chapter in my book devoted to Brother Cuney. Norris Wright Cuney was a high achiever in fraternal, business, labor, and political circles. During the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction periods of American history. And he lived at a time when the infamous Jim Crow laws were being enacted. During Reconstruction, former slaves had made a great deal of progress. But during the post-Reconstruction period, efforts was made to turn the clock back. And a woman named Virginia Neal Hensey, many years ago, wrote a master's thesis on Norris Wright Cuney. She observed he was quite extraordinary in view of the fact that he gained power in the South when most blacks were losing theirs. His life might be viewed as a transition between the Reconstruction and Jim Crow periods. I've been to Sunnyside Plantation outside of Hempstead, Texas, if anybody knows where that is. Colonel Philip Cuney was the father of Norris Wright Cuney. In 1860, he was one of the biggest landowners and slave owners in Texas. He came to Texas from Rapids Parish, Louisiana. And like I say, he was a very wealthy man. I am unsure how many children he had altogether, but I do know that from 1841 until 1860, he was the owner of a slave named Adeline Stewart. And during that period of 19 years, she bore him 8 children, including his most famous offspring, who was Norris Wright Cuney. If you know anything about the history of the Old South, it's not any big secret. The slave owners took advantage of their female slaves sexually. And that's what the origin of mulattoes in America. Many developed during this era, all the way back to the beginning of our country. DNA evidence now gives good support for the idea that Thomas Jefferson was the father of some of the children born by his slave, Sally Hemings. And some slave owners did little to take care of their mulatto children. Colonel Philip Cuney was an exception to this, though. And Norris Wright Cuney was involved in a lot of different things during his lifetime. And his ancestry appears to be quite mixed, including African, European, and Native American. Colonel Philip Minor Cuney was the son of Richmond and Tabitha Wells Cuney. And the white Cuney ancestors came to North America from Wales in the late 18th century. According to family tradition, Philip's grandmother, Louise, left England with her young son, Richmond Edmund, after the imprisonment of her husband for an unknown political offense against the crown. The elder Cuney later died in prison. Louise Cuney first went to French Martinique, where she stayed for a short time, then to New Orleans, arriving sometime before 1780. In Louisiana, the widow Cuney married Caesar Archinard, a recent immigrant from Switzerland. Now, Colonel Philip Cuney was born on March 15, 1807. He moved to Texas in 1837, and he was probably attracted to cheap lands in East Texas. He settled along the Brazos River in Austin County, now Waller County. He named his plantation Sunnyside. It's about 12 miles southeast of Hempstead on the Jose Justo Lindo land grant bordering Iron Creek. He was married a number of times, well, 3 times. Charlotte Scott, Eliza Ware, Adeline Spurlock were his spouses. But again, Adeline Stewart, mother of 8 children, was a very important woman in his life. And she was born in 1825 in Virginia. It was in 1860 he gave her freedom, and freedom to her children. He was involved in educating their 3 sons. And so she eventually returned to Virginia, found her mother living in Alexandria. And Norris Wright Cuney was the 4th of 8 children, all of whom except 2 were born at Sunnyside. All the children resemble their mother except one of the daughters, who had blonde hair like her father. And Colonel Cuney sent Norris Wright to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to attend the Wild Street School, a black institution. And he left Pittsburgh in 1863 and went to St. Louis, hence to Cincinnati, spending more time working on steamboats on the Mississippi River. And he was in New Orleans. He met Lieutenant Colonel James Lewis and Lieutenant Governor Pinckney B.S. Pinchback. They were to play important roles in Louisiana during Reconstruction. But after the Civil War, he settled in Galveston. 1867, there was a yellow fever epidemic. He volunteered his services as a nurse. And this was an example of his willingness to make sacrifices for others. And I mentioned him attending Wild Street School in Pittsburgh. Well, he developed a love for books and for reading. And He studied literature and law. He enjoyed Hebrew, Greek, and Roman history. He also liked the works of Byron and Shakespeare. Throughout his life, Norris Wright Cuney was a staunch advocate of education. He believed that African Americans should receive public education through general school funds, not derived solely from black taxpayers. On July 17, 1871, he was appointed one of the school directors in Galveston County. He always stood up for equal rights for all. And he complained that while black Texans were taxed the same as other Texans, the only public institution open to them were the state penitentiary and the state lunatic asylum. He also called for the establishment of a school for deaf, dumb, and blind black youth. And in 1878, he donated some land. It was instrumental in establishing Prairie View Normal and Industrial Institute, which is now Prairie View A&M University, not far from his place of birth. And he was always a strong supporter of that school. And he spoke at a number of school commencements and a lot of different events. And he was quite interested in Howard University in Washington, D.C. 1896, they gave him an honorary Master of Arts degree. His wife, whom he married in 1871, was Adelina Doughty. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. She was the daughter of a mulatto slave of a white planter, and a mulatto slave mother from Woodville, Mississippi. And so the family was heavily mixed. Their son was Lloyd Garrison Cuney, and their daughter was Maud Cuney Hare. Lloyd Garrison Cuney obviously was named after the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and he worked as a clerk for the federal government in Washington, D.C. And Maud Cuney Hare was a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music, and she wrote a biography of her father, Norris Wright Cuney, a tribute to the black people. Cuney settled in Galveston after the Civil War. He had a stevedore business, quite a few employees on the wharf. He was also very active in politics. Keep in mind, due to the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, at that time in history, most African Americans were Republicans. It wasn't until the 1930s, with the onset of the Great Depression, the vast majority of black voters left the party of Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'm sorry, let me straighten it out here. The party of Abraham Lincoln, they left that party, the Republican Party, and joined the Democratic Party of Franklin D. Roosevelt, because Roosevelt's programs were very helpful to the black community during those hard economic times. And but eventually Cuney became the chairman of the Texas Republican Party, and he was active in a number of different organizations, fraternal wise. And he joined Galveston Lodge number 25 under the jurisdiction of the National Grand Lodge, led by William Matthews of Leavenworth, Kansas. And then on June the 24th, 1874, he was duly elected and installed as the Right Worshipful Deputy Grand Master of the jurisdiction. Keep in mind that's the National Grand Lodge, not the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas that didn't come into existence yet. But in 1875, Norris, Wright, Cuney traveled to Boston, Massachusetts to assist in the proceedings of the Prince Hall Centennial celebration. Prince Hall and 14 other African Americans were initiated by a British traveling lodge at Boston on March 6, 1775. And so 1875 marked the Prince Hall Centennial, and 1975 marked the Prince Hall Bicentennial. And it was 2 months after the Boston meeting that Cuney, along with 14 other Prince Hall Masons, met at St. John AME Church in Brenham, Texas, to organize the most worshipful Grand Lodge, free and accepted ancient York Masons of the state of Texas, now known as the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. With the organization of the new body, Galveston Lodge number 25 became Amity Lodge number 4. This organizing convention elected Cuney as the most worshipful Grand Master. In the first Grand Master's address, he said, "We have met for the purpose of installing officers elected by the convocation to be assembled in the city of Brenham, 19th of August last, to interchange those friendly greetings which ought to submit all Masons to firmly and strongly together, that no earthly power can put asunder." But the actual installation took place on January 19th of 1876, when Cuney and his officers were installed in Houston by Captain William Matthews, Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge, resident of Leavenworth, Kansas. The National Grand Lodge doesn't exist anymore, and Texas was never really a part of it. And William Matthews stirred up a lot of trouble in Masonic history. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But nevertheless, he plays his role in Texas Masonic history is firmly secured for what he did there in Houston in January of 1876. That grand session that year was also held in Houston, and Cuney stepped down. He was succeeded by the Grand Master Richard Allen of Houston. At the 1877 session in the same city, Cuney was elected Grand Master but declined, stating he was unable to serve. Allen was then renominated and elected. And by the way, this Richard Allen of Houston built the first bridge over the Buffalo Bayou. He should never be confused with Richard Allen of Philadelphia, the founder and first bishop of the AME Church. At the 1878 session in Houston, another Houstonian by the name of L.L. James became the third Grand Master. But in 1879, when they were back in Houston again, Cuney did return to the Grand East. And he was reelected in the 1880 session in Galveston and served another year. And he gave quite an impressive Grand Master's address in 1880. And the 1881 session in Austin, Reverend Abram Grant, who in 1888 was elected a bishop in the AME Church. He succeeded Cuney as Grand Master. Then the Grand Session convened in Waco, my hometown, in 1882, and past Grand Master Cuney served as Master of Ceremonies as Chairman of the Committee on Foreign Correspondence. At the election time, he was nominated to return to the Grand East, but was defeated by Reverend Grant. He was also a member of the Knights of Pythias and the Oddfellows. And another organization he was involved in quite heavily was the Union League. This organization was founded in 1862 to preserve the Union, became very popular during Reconstruction for organizing blacks politically and welding them into a coherent voting force. And the mulatto carpetbagger George T. Ruby and J.P. Newcomb, Secretary of State under Governor Edmund J. Davis, served as the state presidents of the Texas Union League. And on July 18, 1871, the Galveston County Union League was established. And guess who they elected as their president? Wright, Norris Wright Cuney. And at one time, he employed 500 black longshoremen in his stevedore business in Galveston. And he was also quite involved with labor issues. He helped settle a wildcat strike in 1877. And 1876, the black longshoremen had organized the first black labor union in Galveston, the Farm Benevolent Association. And he was very successful in business. As I said, he was the undisputed leader of the Texas Republican Party. That was between the years of 1883 and 1896. He controlled federal patronage during Republican administrations. And then he got a big appointment. 1873, he was appointed Inspector of Customs at Galveston by Governor Edmund J. Davis, who was the first Republican governor in Texas. There wouldn't be another one for over 100 years after he left office. And then he served as an alderman on the Galveston City Council and attended a number of Republican conventions. So one convention he attended was in Chicago in 1888. The Republican National Convention nominated Benjamin Harrison of Indiana, who defeated the Democratic incumbent Grover Cleveland in the general election. And Cuney attended Harrison's inauguration, predicted there would be no color line in the Harrison administration. Unfortunately, this prediction was too optimistic. That very year, the white Republicans in Texas, known as the Lily Whites, began to organize in opposition to Cuney. And shortly after Harrison took office, the leading businessmen and politicians in Galveston, Democrat and Republican alike, began a movement to secure for Norris Wright Cuney the appointment as Collector of Customs. And President Harrison discussed the matter with Postmaster General James S. Clarkson, who was a friend of Cuney. Harrison asked Clarkson, if you were president, would you give the most important position in Texas and one of the most important in the whole South to a Negro? Clarkson replied, yes, and be glad the chance when so worthy and fit a man for the position, and a colored man endorsed as to the fitness and reliability for the place by all the Democratic businessmen of the city. So the president signed the appointment and sent it to the U.S. Senate for confirmation. When the confirmation came before the U.S. Senate, at the time, there were two U.S. senators from Texas, both Freemasons and both ex-Confederates, John H. Reagan and Richard Koch. Reagan voted for the confirmation of Cuney. Koch abstained. In January of 1890, Norris Wright Cuney took office as Collector of Customs. And his position has been described as the most important post any African American would receive in the late 19th century South. And when he was in office, at the Customs House, he visited many county fairs, delivered addresses on the tariff, industrial conditions, education, and race relations. And a number of public schools were named for him. He spoke out strongly against the separate coach law pending before the 23rd legislation. Unfortunately, in 1891, this bill was passed and became Texas' first Jim Crow law. And by 1892, he seemed to be losing his power. And the Republicans were no longer actively seeking black support. Republicans in 1892 didn't nominate a candidate for governor. The Democrats split into regular and gold factions. The gold Democrats offered a form of coalition with Cuney, and he accepted. In this election, the regular faction nominated governor incumbent James Stephen Hogg, while the gold faction nominated Judge George Clark of Waco. Hogg sent his emissaries to the Republican State Convention seeking black votes. Rumors of attempted bribery were widespread. On one occasion, Cuney kept silent and laughed when asked if Hogg people tried to bribe him. Hogg supporters circulated posters containing Hogg's proclamation and rewards for apprehension of lynchers. Hogg himself tried to keep overt racism out of the campaign. But Senator Richard Koch, who had abstained when Cuney's name came before the Senate to be confirmed as Collector of Customs, he did not keep racism out of the campaign. He called for the defeat of the three C's, Clark, Cuney, and the Coons. Hogg won the election. And it's interesting, in his autobiography, George Clark says nothing about Norris Wright Cuney's support, but he does describe the election. The election came on, and while I received 130,000 votes, Governor Hogg received a much larger one. I was defeated by 50,000 majority. Even the Negroes who voted as a rule voted for Governor Hogg. I was told afterward that he had promised them a university at Prairie View similar to the State University in Austin by the whites. During the 1892 presidential election, Grover Cleveland defeated Benjamin Harrison to become the only president in U.S. history so far to hold two non-consecutive terms. Cleveland was elected in 1884, defeated for re-election in 1882, then won a rematch in I'm sorry, he was elected in 1884, defeated in 1888, won again in 1892. And following his 1893 inauguration, Cleveland received appeals from a number of Galveston businessmen, urging him to allow Cuney to maintain his position as collector of customs. Unfortunately, Cleveland rejected these pleas and removed Cuney from office. And in 1894, at the Republican State Convention in Dallas, the Lily White faction was successful in manipulating some of Cuney's enemies in the black community against him. And they openly declared their support for segregation, and Cuney declared that there is no common ground between true Republicans and the Lily Whites. And then the year 1896 has been described as a year of victory for William McKinley, a year of defeat for Norris, Wright, Cuney. At the 1896 Republican State Convention in Austin, Cuney supported William B. Allison for president, and he went on to St. Louis in June of that year, the Republican National Convention. His delegation was not seated, but the McKinley delegation, led by Republican State Committee Chair John T. Grant, was seated. And Grant had been a protege of Cuney. He suffered from mental illness and was not effective in office. The entire convention was very humiliating for Cuney, who went home feeling betrayed. And so eventually his influence in Republican circles dwindled. And he was spending much of his time in San Antonio. His health was deteriorating. And his last days have been thus described: his magnificent health gone, his spirit broken by his wife's death in 1895, his tuberculosis reactivated by cigar smoking and lack of rest. Cuney retired to San Antonio after the campaign of 1896. Maud had wanted her father to retire earlier, but he refused until a relapse following an attack of influenza forced him to do so. He was, however, still well enough early in 1897 to go to a patronage meeting in Houston, a New Year's Eve ball in Fort Worth, and to visit his son and daughter in Austin. And then it was on March the 3rd, 1898, his mother, his brother Joseph, and his son Lloyd arrived from Galveston on the day of his death. Cuney, who was in full control of his mental power until the end, had his aged mother led from the room just before his death. With his head cradled in Maud's arm, he whispered, "My work is ended." He kissed his daughter farewell and died. His body lay in state all day at St. Paul Methodist Episcopal Church in San Antonio. Then it was transported by special train to Galveston, escorted by the Excelsior Guards, a black militia regiment. Upon arrival in Galveston, his body lay in state at Reedy Chapel, AME Church, until it was transported to Harmony Hall, the local Masonic building, where his funeral was held on March the 6th. Thousands of people, black and white, attended. And the processional from Harmony Hall to Lakeview Cemetery was the largest processional in the history of Galveston. It included the following: mounted police, a Dixieland band, officiating ministers, Excelsior Guards of San Antonio, Cocky Rifles of Houston, Lincoln Guards of Galveston, Cotton Screwmen, Longshoremen's Aid Association, Knights of Pythias, Oddfellows, Silver Trowel Lodge number 47 of Houston, Magnolia Lodge number 3 of Houston, Southgate Lodge number 32 of Galveston, Amity Lodge number 4 of Galveston, the Grand Lodge officers. And his funeral was held at Reedy Chapel, Galveston. Services were conducted by Dr. L. H. Reynolds of New Orleans, assisted by Reverend M. R. Moody, pastor of Reedy Chapel. The Masonic service was conducted by Grand Master John Wesley McKinney of Sherman, who later became a bishop in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, CME, assisted by Deputy Past Master Lawrence and Past Grand Masters Richard Allen and J. H. Armstrong. Armstrong, by this time, was a bishop in the AME Church. And then Dr. Reynolds said in his eulogy of Cuney, "No one ever knew when he was defeated. Often when the heat of battle someone sounded retreat, when disaster seemed traced in letters of ominous blackness on the banner which floated over the scattered allies, he would emerge at the head of a new force and move on to victory. Know ye not that a great man has fallen this day in Israel?" And then it was on August 20th, 1941, that Grand Master William Coleman led the Prince Hall Masons of Texas in a gathering across from St. John, AME Church in Brenham, to dedicate a monument to Cuney and other brethren involved at the organizational meeting at St. John's Church in 1875. On June the 21st, 1964, Grand Master John Theodore Maxey led members of the craft in the dedication of the Wright Cuney Monument beside their first Grand Master's grave at Lakewood Cemetery in Galveston. And so there's no question this man had a lot of influence. And it was in September of 1995 that I was among those Prince Hall Masons to go to St. John AME Church to mark the 120th anniversary of some of those events. And it was in her 1965 thesis that Virginia Neal Hensey said of Cuney, "His position in Texas history and in Negro thought has significance as a protester, as one who fought against the tide to keep democracy alive in a one-party state where race prejudice was the norm. He moved 1 inch only to be pushed back by the white majority. He at least made the effort. He burdened himself to smooth the way for future Negroes and whites. Men like Cuney are rare. Indeed they are." Since 1875, 21 men have served as Grand Masters of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas, beginning with Norris Wright Cuney. The office is currently held by my longtime friend Wilbert Curtis. And each of these men has made a difference in their own way. Those of us who recognize the value of such a great fraternity recognize the legacy left by all those who preceded us. And on this day, May the 12th, in the year 1846, who would have known a mulatto child, born a slave on a plantation, Sunnyside Plantation, at Hempstead, Texas, would grow up in his relatively short lifespan of not quite 52 years, would contribute so much to business and labor, to politics, and to fraternalism. Norris Wright Cuney was truly a great man. We give him honor these many years after his death. Have a good evening.